All right, week 6, global stratification, part 2. Now I hope you took advantage of looking at the video from part 1 plus the Hans Rosling video. It may have helped you get a better grip of some of the issues. Now here in part 2, and if you haven't looked at that video, I really encourage you to go back to week 5 and look at it. We're going to look at global poverty and human development issues. Now the human development issues often come out of the WHO, the World Health Organization, but it's through a collaborative effort through a number of countries. And we're going to look at theories of global inequality in the future, are the two main areas of today's part 2. And so when you think about theories of global inequality, we're going to look at, well, why does that exist? What perpetuates it? And where do we see global inequity in the future? So when you think in terms of this topic, some of the questions that might come to mind, especially if you've previewed the chapter, is, what is modernization theory? That's one of the theories we're going to look at in terms of this inequity and global poverty. And what are its stages? Now, many of these theories will have stages or parts, if you will. How do conflict theorists explain the pattern of global stratification? What is the world systems theory? There are a number of theories we're going to look at, and part of this will help us understand these perpetuation of inequities. How is the new system of global trade affecting people in poor countries? So we're going to look at, very briefly really, what are some of the features that are maintaining the world stratification the way that it is, or what are some of the things that are making it better, or for that matter even making it worse. And so what we're going to start with for part 2 then is looking at life expectancy, health, education, literacy, what those things are and how they impact global stratification. So that's what we're going to lead off with. I will start posting some additional things in the weeks to sort of help you give additional information. For example, Gapminder does have some resources on life expectancy. I may just post a little something to help you understand what life expectancy is and how it's understood. It may not be exactly the way you think. All right, good luck, and I hope you enjoyed this chapter. This is a significant chapter in Sociology 2 when we start to branch it out into more of a global perspective. Good luck, everyone. Life expectancy. Now, I've done a couple of things in the week 5 folder, which I hope you'll have paid attention to last week, but it prepares for this. And that is, I put in a video by Hans Rosling and a PowerPoint by Gapminder regarding what is life expectancy, how is it calculated, so you have a better handle on it. So when we think in terms of the life expectancy, if you notice on this particular table, look at the rank from 1 going down to 12, and then look at the distribution down to 177. And if you look right across to the per capita or the gross development product, you see that the higher you are in the rank, the higher you also are in the per capita in terms of income, down to the lowest. Now, life expectancy has improved over time. Now, it also shows this, this graphic here shows the relationship between income per capita and the health and the overall life expectancy of a nation. Now, this is what I've had posted for you already before. Life expectancy has improved over time, and the average increase of about 30% in the past 3 decades, and is now more than 70 years old on an average for life expectancy in 87 different nations. Now, to remind you, in this particular graphic, the left-hand y-axis is life expectancy in years ranging from 50 up to 85, and then along the bottom x-axis you see the per capita, and you see the relationship between wealth and health. Now, you'll find that in spite of this increase in many other the more developed nations of life expectancy, in some countries it's actually decreased. In some of the sub-Saharan African countries, oftentimes the reasons for the decrease in life expectancy has less to do with the natural conditions as much as it has to do with the degree of disease that can occur. Now, some of the reasons that there's been some changes in life expectancy in different parts of the world has been in different parts of Africa. AIDS has been significant and has had an impact. High infant mortality rates around the world in lower income countries. Malnutrition of about 1 billion people in the world. Hunger, about 9 million people die each year from hunger, and 10 million children under the age of 5 die each year. So in spite of, and in fact, if we look at more current information, more current data, your textbook's not the most current reference to data, we actually see that some of these things have changed over time and are actually better than what some of the older conditions suggest. So life expectancy has improved, and when you watch that PowerPoint, it sort of walks you through a little bit about how to understand how is life expectancy calculated and to get a better perspective about where life expectancy is today. Now, after life expectancy, we can look at health. And health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And now that's a particularly different shift and look at what is health. Health had long time been viewed as particularly the lack of disease or more the physicalness of our existence. The more rounded and more up-to-date version of what is defined as health includes social and mental well-being. Now there's 4.6 billion people who live in developing countries. 2.7 don't have proper sanitation. 1.2 billion don't have clean water, and 12 million die from diarrhea, malaria, and tuberculosis. Now it puts in some perspective that certainly some parts of the world, particularly those that make less money per capita than the higher and more developed countries, disease and illness rank much higher. Despite these figures, the good news is that over the past 30 years, there have been improvements in life expectancy at birth, infancy, and child mortality and malnutrition. And again, so I would encourage you to check out some of the Gapminder videos, particularly those done by Hans Rosling, to look at what are the more current view of the world in terms of life expectancy, health, and, as we'll look at here, education. Education is a fundamental life chance in reducing poverty. It is considered the most important or primary life chance. Now, one of the ways that they measure education around the world is through literacy, and a person who can and with understanding both read and write a short, simple statement about their everyday life is considered literate. And that rate is increasing dramatically as well. Now, the rate is low in low-income nations, is about 50% lower than those in high-income nations. But the most current data is suggesting that this gap is starting to adjust and change. Women constitute about 66% of those who are illiterate. Now, again, I'm going to emphasize this because it's a misnomer that a lot of these data that we see in texts that are perhaps not as up-to-date in terms of the data that it's expressing, like your text that you have for this class, that these data are older. That during your assignment, I hope that through going to the Gapminder site and reviewing more current data, you'll see where some of this has been shifting, and perhaps even more dramatically than you have imagined or thought. Now, one of the big areas that a lot of the international attention is brought to is this gender and equality issue. Women suffer more than men in a global inequity. Real problems as it relates to families. Some of the elements associated with this would be that girls are less desired generally than boys in lower income, but not exclusively, around the world. Girls are more likely to drop out of school. They're more likely to receive less education, and they are paid less than men for the same work. Now, this has started to adjust with the amount of attention being drawn to what the role of women is in making improvements in families, particularly in lower income countries. So some of the progress that we've seen, that between 1990 and 2001, the ratio of literate females has increased from 70 women to every 100 women to 81 women to every 100 men. During that similar period of time, 1990 to the year 2000, girls in school rose from 66 girls to every 100 boys to 92 girls to every 100 boys. And we're seeing this as a consistent and regular positive increase in what's occurring for girls. Now with that comes some other benefits. Now you find this in your textbook, and what you're looking at is what happens when girls are educated. They tend to marry later, and there's many effects on the household as a result of that, and then the overall effect that it has on society. Girls with better education and how the effects are real. Girls marry later, they have fewer children, there's lower maternal mortality rate, and they bring in much more needed income. Now you'll see this particular graphic here. I'm not going to leave it up a lot, but you can pause and look at it and read a little bit that's there regarding what the ripple effect is by educating girls who live in low-income circumstances. Now we're going to quickly review some of the theories that look at this issue of global inequality and how come it exists. We're going to look at modernization theory, dependency theory, world systems theory, and the new international divisions of labor theory. Now don't get too upset or sort of, oh, more theory. Remember, these are just like, sunglasses. They, different ways of looking at a very, common experience out there. So they have a slightly different view from each other about what explains this. Modernization theory, this is a perspective that links global inequality to different levels of economic development and suggests that low-income economies can move to middle and high-income economies by achieving self-sustained economic growth. And what you're seeing here are some stages of which that can occur, from traditional to takeoff to technologically maturity. Now, the most common reason for the lack of development is a traditional lifestyle that tends to be fatalistic in outlook. It's slow to change, they don't have a strong work ethic, and they can't save very much money. Now some of the critique to this particular theory is that it's particularly Eurocentric. Now when they talk about Eurocentricity, what they're meaning here is it has a particularly European outlook and view of things. It doesn't look at it from the perspective of those other countries very strongly. Now, Frank argues that there is a process of development of underdeveloped as high-income nations invest in these countries and cause them to be dependent on them. That the more higher-income countries support lower-income countries, these lower-income countries become dependent. And so it sort of stifles their ability to develop and gain a stronger foothold in moving in through the middle income up to higher income countries. Now we consider dependency theory. Now this one here, the theme here is that rich countries have a vested interest in maintaining a dependent status with poorer countries, using them to gather raw materials to be manufactured in the rich countries. And we see this occurring all over the world, whether it's a country, for example, like China, who purchases land in other countries like Africa to produce growing fields for their own nation's benefit, not necessarily for Africa's benefit. And with dependency theory, there's the global poverty that can be at least partially attributed to the fact that the low-income countries have been exploited by the high-income countries. Evidence for dependency theory can be best applied to the newly industrialized countries of Latin America. The theory aids us in understanding that the underdevelopment is a result both of one country's exploiting as another, as well as the transnational corporations exploiting new nations. So as nations become stronger and stronger economically, the higher income nations have a tendency to exploit those nations by taking advantage of the products that they can produce at a cheaper rate. Now, some of the problems that exist is that the theory helps us to understand Latin America, but not necessarily the Eastern Rim Pacific countries, more in the Asia and some of the islands down in that area, who also receive aid, but have been experienced rapid growth like South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore. Estimates are that they will grow on average about 9% each year in the near future. And so the dependency theory has a fair amount of weakness. If you have a theory that's labeled dependency, it suggests then that one country is dependent on another, and that's not necessarily going to be beneficial for that one that's dependent. Now, the third theory we'll touch on just briefly again will be world systems theory. And here the capitalist world economy is a global system divided into a hierarchy of three major types, if you will. There's core, there's peripheral, and there's semi-peripheral, in which upward and downward mobility is conditioned by the resources and the obstacles that characterize the international system. So the core, these are the dominant capitalist nations. They have high levels of industrialization, high levels of urbanization. Now, the thesis here is that the core nations, they tend to exploit peripheral nations at their own expense, at the peripheral nations' expense. The semi-peripheral ones, well, they're more partially exploited, but they benefit more from the peripheral ones. And so there's a sort of a shared exploitation that occurs where some will benefit more than others. If you will, it's very much based on an interdependence. That is to say that countries depend on one another. However, some tend to take more advantage of others, and others can benefit, and some don't benefit quite as well. The last one we're going to touch on is the new international division of labor. Now, the thesis here is commodity productions are being split into fragments. So taking the way that we produce products, breaking it into smaller jobs, if you will, that can be assigned to whichever part of the world can best provide the most profitable combination of capital and labor, that is, costs and people to do the work. And so with this particular one, we see more examples of smaller countries or countries with lower income being taken advantage of because they sell the labor of their laborers cheaper. They maybe don't have as many regulations, in particular around safety. You might remember in India the sweatshops that were burnt down to the ground because they were designed for 6-story and 5-story buildings, and they added 4 and 5 new floors on them when they weren't physically able to withstand that. They were the places that were making the products for Joe Fresh. And so we see examples, and this is where this division of labor occurs. That the World Trade Liberalization Agreements have reduced many barriers to the transfer of goods across the globe. These agreements don't benefit the poor nations as well. If workers ask for more money, the company will look to another country with more and cheaper labor. So the kinds of products that are taking advantage are labor is intensive and assembly-oriented productions like textiles, clothing, technologically sophisticated exports like computers. Many of the companies that provide us with the things that we buy in North America are made in other parts of the world where arguably they're being taken advantage of, in part because they can provide some services and some products cheaper. Now, all of this is probably going to have a shift in terms of the different kinds of changes that can occur in political systems. So for example, those of you who are more aware of what's going on around the world now, and you've been aware of the change of government in the United States, the kinds of things that Trump can do on the world stage regarding trade agreements, which he's talked quite a bit about. He's already pulled out of the TTP and wants to renegotiate the NAFTA. So these renegotiations of trade and keeping things very close to the vest, as the U.S. wants to be America first, this is going to have a ripple effect on how it affects these other countries and also how it will affect the United States. So some of the problems that exist is that nations do not benefit from the external, but the external companies do. So the countries don't benefit as much as the companies do in this worldview. Results in the global commodity change, a complex pattern of international labor and production processes that result in finished commodity ready for sale in the marketplace. And so none of these particular theories are absolutely right, but they are different views on the same issue. And of course, this is a very dynamic issue because, like I said, even if there's a political change, not even just in the United States, as we're seeing it right now, but in any other part of the world, has a ripple effect on how this will play out. So when we consider, in many countries, economic process has sort of stalled at this point, that poor human development can be the result. It occurs more in the sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe, more growth of the core nations at the expense of others. Yet many countries have become industrialized, and many others will as well. You're seeing here what are some of the newer industrialized countries. Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, India, South Africa, Thailand, China, Malaysia. 20 years ago, they weren't industrialized countries. And so they're newly industrialized, and more countries are becoming more and more industrialized. More growth on core nations at the expense of others. For example, coffee, 1990 to 2005, coffee has sold sold from 30 billion to 80 billion. This is the same coffee that's grown year in and year out, but the coffee sold has gone up. So the production of coffee has gone up. Income received by the producers has dropped from 12 billion to 5.5 billion. So as much as the sale of coffee has gone up dramatically, 30 to 80 billion, the money that the producers, the growers of coffee, has gone down from 12 to 5.5, which means the farmer gets less than 1 cent for every cup of coffee sold. So when you think in terms of the benefit to lower income countries, the US doesn't make coffee, Canada doesn't make coffee, Turkey does, Guatemala does, Jamaica does. There are coffees growing all over the world, other than some of the more richer countries, and some of these farmers are not getting the advantages as, say, Starbucks and Tim Hortons are, who aren't paying for the coffee to the growers quite as they were. Some other issues. Continued population growth, urbanization, environmental degradation. Well, many countries have become industrialized and have started to improve their standards. So most nations are starting to recognize human rights. More people are educated. Incomes have begun to increase. And there's more education for women, and nations are having free elections. And so we start to see that the future could look a little brighter. However, we don't know what implications, changes in government will be, and we don't know in terms of companies, which companies will withdraw from what countries and start to emerge in other countries. So the future is really hard to determine, but it can have some positive outlooks when human rights are being expanded. There's income change for those who are of lower income countries, and more education can all have a huge benefit to the lower income countries. Okay, there is the end of part 2 on global stratification. Let's keep on keeping on and carry on the good work. Bye now.